Hey there, it's Brett from the Denver House Church. Hope everyone's doing well. Ashley, Nels, and I miss you all like crazy. I'm so blessed today to be thinking about all of you worshiping alongside us every Sunday and keeping the faith here in the Denver metro area. I'm going to be reading today's scripture reading, which is 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through 9. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through 9. Take care, everyone, and have a great Sunday.
Hey there, good morning. Go ahead and open up a Bible or a Bible app on your phone if you have it, and turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. We are in a series called Citizens. We're working through the letter of 1 Peter. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian-born Jewish psychiatrist, a brilliant author. He wrote a well-known book called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. Frankl spoke in his writings of how within the concentration camps, those who found meaning in their life, even in the most horrendous of circumstances, were far more resilient to suffering than those who did not find meaning in their lives. Viktor Frankl, he says this in Man's Search for Meaning. I love this quote. He says, "The human who knows the why for their existence will be able to bear almost any how." Isn't this so true for all of us? When we understand the purpose and the meaning of something, it gives us the ability to work almost through any sort of pain and suffering that it might take to get to the other side of something. This is common wisdom for something like building a savings account, for instance. You understand that, in building a savings account, in the early years, you go through the pain of not spending money so that later on in life you would have something like a savings account. People today definitely understand this when it comes to training our bodies with like running or working out or cycling or something, physical activity. This is why for me, I always was terrible at math. I wasn't willing to go through the pain and the suffering of algebra or geometry. I know some of you love that, but I wasn't willing to go through the suffering of that class because I just could not see the purpose or the why. Why do I need to work on these obscure things of math skills? I think they matter to me a little more now. In 1 Peter, Peter opens up this beautiful letter to a group of people who are going through a horrible time. And Peter is speaking purpose and meaning over these people. Peter says, God has saved you. God is saving you currently. He is rescuing you. You have a hope in Jesus who is alive and well. Jesus is working in the world currently. Peter is speaking to them. He's saying, I know you're poor right now. You're rejected by society, but God has given you an eternal inheritance that's being kept safe. It's never going to be stolen or go bad. You have so much purpose and meaning to live for. Peter is speaking this over these people. And actually, the same thing is spoken over us today. There is so much global confusion and grief, and American confusion and grief happening right now at this very moment. And these things that Peter is speaking at the opening of 1 Peter, these things are spoken over us. And we need to really, just pause and let them wash over us. God is saving us. He is rescuing us. He has given us a living hope in Jesus Christ. He has given us an eternal inheritance. I love how Peter just begins his letter with just such encouragement to the church, such encouragement to these people who are suffering. I also love how Peter and the scriptures and Christianity are also not oblivious to suffering and pain. They're not. You don't really read in the scriptures this attitude of just get over it. Peter doesn't act like, oh, you should just forget about suffering and pain. It's not a big deal. Just pretend that it doesn't exist. You don't see that attitude. I love this. I appreciate it about the Christian faith. There is trouble in this life, but what do we make of it? Today I have 3 simple points that I want to make. And the first is this. We need to take hold of and see the beauty of our salvation. In verse 6, Peter starts by saying, "In this you rejoice." And what is he talking about that they should rejoice in? Like, what is he saying leading up to this moment that these people should be so excited about, that they should be rejoicing? We don't often use that word in our modern culture, like, hey, we should get together and rejoice. It definitely means exuberance. It's a party. It should be filled with joy and excitement. What should they be rejoicing in? It's everything that Peter was talking about right up to before verse 6. It's their salvation. It's that God is saving them. He is rescuing them. And he says, in this you rejoice. But it's actually funny because commentators kind of argue they're unsure of how exactly Peter is making this statement to his audience, his listeners. Is Peter commanding them, in this you should rejoice? Or is Peter saying, good job, well done. Look at how in this you rejoice. You're rejoicing in your salvation. Well done. Or is Peter possibly speaking in like a past tense? You used to rejoice in Jesus. Please return back to the joy that you used to have. And so it's actually hard to know exactly how Peter is using this phrase, and a lot of commentators actually think it's ambiguous for a reason. And the reason is that these kind of statements could be spoken to any kind of person or many kinds of people in different situations, different seasons of their life. And the same could be said for us today. And so I just ask you, what might you possibly need to hear today? Do you need to hear there is hope and joy in Jesus today? Even though you're suffering right now, Jesus would love to bring you joy, and you should rejoice. Maybe you need to hear that today. Maybe some of you need to hear, well done, keep it up. Your joy in Jesus is so apparent. I can see how there's suffering and trouble in your life, but I'm so encouraged by how you are responding with rejoicing in Jesus Christ. There's a lot of you in our community that I could definitely say this about, and I've seen you, and well done. Good job. Keep it up. Maybe some of you need to hear today, I often need to hear this last one. You were filled with so much joy when you first came to faith in Jesus. Be filled again. Return to your first love. Do you see the joy in Jesus? Do you see the joy in your salvation that you should have? And all of this actually does begin to help us to understand some of the other parts of these verses. Verses 8 and 9, where Peter writes, though you have not seen him, you love him. This could be a command or an encouragement, or both. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Is Peter saying, well done? Look at how you have faith even though you don't currently see Jesus in the flesh, even though you're not currently walking with Jesus in the flesh like Peter did? Or is he saying, hey, you should have inexpressible joy because of Jesus? Honestly, the answer is all of the above. The question is, what do you need to hear today? That's what I think God is speaking to me for us, our community, in this moment. What do we need to hear? The fact is that we all need to meditate on the beauty and the reality of what God has done for us, what God is doing for us. We need to meditate on the beauty and the reality of our salvation, our purpose, our why in this world. Remember how much grace God has given you, even though you deserve none of it. You should have inexpressible joy, joy beyond words. Remember that we have already been made citizens of a future kingdom and government that God is building right now. And I'm not talking about America. I'm talking about the kingdom of heaven. That should really bring so much joy and purpose. Through this presidential election season, we should be holding on to the fact that we have citizenship in heaven right now. That why, that purpose should root us as we work through so much of the weirdness of right now, as it seems that America is just so confused. We should be less confused. We are rooted in something that's eternal and sure and right. We have to remember the reality of the cross and the resurrection and what it really means for our life, like what it really means. We will ultimately give up and we will find meaning in something else if we forget that purpose, if we forget the reality, if we're not constantly meditating on this reality of the cross and the resurrection, we will find our meaning and our purpose in something else. We'll worship something else. I think this is what has happened to the American church. We have lost our sense of purpose and our hope in heaven, our hope in eternity. And when this happens, the moment that any sort of pain, any sort of displeasure, discomfort, or pressure is applied, we immediately run away. We run to a totally lesser God. We run to the God of politics. We see this happening. We run to something and we beg for it to take away some of this slight and momentary suffering. I think this is what we're seeing in our country at this moment. It is idol worship, ultimately. We're begging a lesser God to save us when we should be remembering our purpose. We should be rooted in the cross and the resurrection and the hope of eternity that God has already spoken over us. We should be rooted in Jesus Christ. Have we taken hold of our salvation in Jesus? Do we truly understand our purpose? Because, come on, if this isn't already obvious to you, trouble is on its way. That's not like a weird prophetic word. I'm just saying it's just normal to life. It's becoming so clear here in America. We're not just a perfect country where we never deal with problems. Trouble is a normal part of life, and especially if you follow Jesus. Suffering, pain, and trouble is so normal. And this is my second point today. Brings me to this. Number 2, suffering is normal, but suffering is temporary. This really is just kind of common sense that Peter is bringing to us, but it has to be said. Because there's actually been entire church movements that have been built on preaching that suffering is not a part of following Jesus. In fact, it's often preached that Jesus will take away all suffering in some of these church movements, and this is ridiculous. If you just look out in the world and see the way that Christians and Jesus followers have been treated down throughout history, it's not just all peachy. It's been a lot of suffering and martyrdom. B, this is ridiculous if you just look in the scriptures. It never says, hey, if you follow Jesus, it'll just be a party from the moment you put your faith in him until you die. It's quite the opposite. Romans 6:5 says, if we have been united with Jesus in a death like his, we will also be united with him in a resurrection like his. It says that we are united with Jesus in a death like his. We're united in his death. In baptism, we are united with Jesus in his burial. Now, there is hope that is spoken. We're also united in Jesus' resurrection. We're united in new life. But my point, what I want to highlight, is that we join Jesus in suffering. I mean, Jesus says to his disciples, as they are following him in the Gospels, he says, take up your cross and follow me. The same thing is spoken to us. Today we're included in that call. Take up your cross and follow me. Kent Hughes says this. He says, what are our crosses? They are not simply trials or hardships. Some think of a nutty boss or an unfair teacher or a bossy mother-in-law as a cross, but they are not. Neither can we properly call an illness or a handicap a cross. A cross results from specifically walking in Christ's steps, embracing his life. It comes from bearing disdain because we are following the narrow way of Jesus Christ, the way and the truth and the life, as John 14:6 says. It comes from living out the business and sexual ethics of Christ in the marketplace, the community, the family, and the world. It comes from standing true in difficult circumstances for the sake of the gospel. Our crosses come from and are proportionate to our dedication to Christ. Difficulties do not indicate cross-bearing, though difficulties for Christ's sake do. Do we have any difficulties because we are closely following Jesus? The New Testament promises, in the world you will have trouble. I mean, Jesus literally says this in the Gospel of John. He says this to his disciples. The New Testament promises we will experience suffering precisely because we follow Jesus. Suffering is part of what we are called into. It's part of the deal. We will suffer ultimately because the world rejects Jesus. And so often I even think, if I'm just winsome enough, if I'm just humble and gracious enough, which we have to be, I so often think that people aren't going to reject me, but the world rejects Jesus. The world did reject Jesus. When I get caught up in trying to make Jesus seem relevant or cool within our modern world, I am forgetting that Jesus was murdered brutally for the things that he said and did. And Jesus was speaking the hope. He was speaking good news. He came in humility. He was a servant. And this man, even though a gracious, humble, hope-speaking, good news-speaking servant. Even though he was all those things, he was killed. Why would I expect everyone to just constantly love me and like me for following that same person who was murdered at the cross? Suffering is a part of the deal. But I love, Peter does make such a logical point when he says in verse 6, though now for a little while. Peter is just making an aside. Trials, tribulation, suffering, trouble. In the grand scheme of eternity, these things are just a drop in the bucket. It's just for a moment when compared to eternity. I have to say, this can be really hard to say to some of you who may really be suffering. But the truth of this should be so liberating or encouraging. It should give you freedom. That's the point. This is especially liberating news when you have eternity in view. Just for a little while now, hang in there. Stay the course. You may be struggling, choosing to follow Jesus, suffering with holding on to the ethics of Jesus that he often calls us to, the high standard of obeying Jesus. But hang in there. Eternity is on its way. This is meant to encourage you and uplift you. And of course, we in the church are meant to weep and grieve and with one another when others around us are suffering. We never just say, get over it. Just trust in God. We never say anything like that. But we do remind one another of eternity and God's beautiful plan for redemption and how God is inviting all of us to play a part in it. Suffering is only momentary. And if we take hold of the purpose and meaning that God has given us, then our suffering will really become less and less. Or, as the old hymns say, the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the light of your glory, God. Which brings me to my third and final point today. Suffering actually carries a ton of purpose in our lives. So for Peter, suffering is not only inevitable, it's not just temporary, but suffering also carries a really important purpose for us. And the purpose is this: when you suffer, you can see if your faith is genuine or not. Suffering is a test. Peter makes this comparison with the way that gold is purified. And gold is literally refined and purified with fire. But Peter makes the point that gold ultimately will die. It will perish. You don't keep gold after you die. And I love, by the way, that Peter makes this kind of point throughout the whole letter. He makes this kind of point of, why not give your life to something that never dies? So suffering is like a fire that purifies and tests how genuine our faith actually is. And I think we can understand this when it comes to our relationships. Whether this is friendships or romantic relationships, marriage relationships, dating relationships. A true friendship or relationship can go through hard times and suffering and get to the other side and still have the relationship intact. In fact, healthy relationships deepen when they go through pain and suffering together, when they go through hard times. Have you ever experienced this? When you go through the hard knocks of life with someone, it either breaks you, up, or it makes your relationship so much stronger, Suffering is a real test of any relationship. If the moment that friction or pressure arrives, you realize this relationship is not worth it, then you probably weren't that committed in the first place. It wasn't really very genuine, was definitely not a strong relationship. And on the flip side, if you have a relationship that fights through every and any problem, and then it gets stronger on the other side, then that is a real relationship. That is a relationship worth trusting. I hope there are people and friendships and relationships that are coming to your mind, people who have stuck with it, through the hard times with you. This is how faith in Jesus works. And guess what? We all fail, by the way. We're all the bad friends in this relationship with Jesus. He's never the one who just says, I can't do this anymore. He's never the one who flakes or sends a last minute, like bail on you text, which I know Jesus doesn't text. That sounds silly. Jesus is always the one who remains. He's never bailing on the relationship. This testing is mainly for us, if you really think about it. It's for us to gauge and see, how much are you really trusting Jesus? He is there. He's not going anywhere. But what is the genuineness of your trust and faith in Him? If you bail on Jesus the moment that trouble arrives, then maybe you have less faith than you thought. When temptation arrives in your life, if you so quickly abandon this Jesus who you supposedly love, then maybe the genuineness of that faith, maybe the genuineness of that love is being tested. For us living in 21st century Western civilization, I believe that suffering will mainly look like us resisting temptation. I do believe that the more and more of us are going to begin to lose jobs or lose friendships or relationships because we choose to follow Jesus. I think that is more on the horizon here in America and Western culture. I think we'll experience some of that kind of suffering, but mainly I believe we suffer currently by choosing not to practice or participate in the sinful things that we see in our surrounding culture. Us choosing to be non-participants, to resist, that is a form of suffering. For us to deny ourselves certain pleasures because we follow Jesus, this is a form of godly suffering. I mean, because think about it. If our eternity was not a reality, if heaven was not a reality, if what God has invited us into in salvation was not true, then why would we ever withhold any pleasure in this life? Why wouldn't we just make this life all about us all right now? I really mean that. But I hold to the salvation that God has invited us into, the reality of the future of eternity. And because that is something that I hold on to, it's worth it to choose to abstain a little in this life. Because Jesus has called us into a better way. And not only that, but along the way, Jesus has shown me and shown many others through Jesus' wisdom why that's a better way for human flourishing. These ethics and these sexual ethics and ethics around money are not just random things that God invites us into just to torture us, to keep us from pleasure. It's for our own human flourishing. But mainly, I think we will see suffering in that we're choosing not to participate in the sin of the world around us. That is godly suffering. A Jesus follower does not just give their body over to every sexual desire. A Jesus follower does not just do whatever they want with their money. Our life is not about just fulfilling every desire. We entrust our bodies and our dollars to a God who is wiser than us and loves us actually more than we love ourselves. We don't just see our money as ours. We are generous and we see our money as a way of building God's kingdom. Why would someone do that if they didn't have eternity in view? You need to know your purpose. We give our money away when Jesus calls us to because we have eternity in view. It's not my money, and ultimately it's going to go away, and ultimately God has an inheritance for me in heaven. Ultimately, these are types of momentary suffering. And when we resist this temptation, we are actually allowing our faith to be tested in the fire. And this is a good and beautiful thing. And my question for all of us is this today. What do you need to hear from Peter? What do you need to hear today? Do you need to hear? You should be rejoicing in the hope of Jesus. Rejoice in Jesus. Or do you need to hear, well done, keep it up. Look at how you are rejoicing and dealing with suffering in this life. I can see that you see Jesus as true hope. Keep it up. Or do you need to hear, hey, return to your first love? Do you remember the first hope that you clung to when you first put hope in Jesus? Where are you at today? How are the troubles of this world currently hitting you? And what do you need to hear?